Coming into the 2024-25 NBA season, expectations for the Sacramento Kings were pretty high. They were coming off a season where they won 46 games, which was two less than the season prior. They had missed the playoffs, and they missed the playoffs because they didn't make any changes in the offseason. They had some injuries at the end of that season. And so while missing the playoffs was extremely disappointing, it still felt like the Kings had a bright future as long as they made the necessary moves to improve the roster. And so coming into the 24-25 season, they did improve the roster, and they did it by going after a big name, going star hunting, bringing in DeMar DeRozan after a lack of scoring and creation was what really hurt them at the end of last season. And so while DeMar coming in did not address many of the defensive concerns that many people had about this team, and also definitely didn't address the lack of depth, especially at the wing position, it still felt like the Kings were in for a pretty big season, or at least a big regular season. There were plenty of concerns to be had come playoff time, but it felt like with the amount of talent on this roster, it felt like the offense would be enough to carry the Kings through a regular season, especially since the defense had improved the prior season in large part due to the emergence of Keon Ellis, and DeMar was not necessarily a downgrade defensively for Harrison Barnes in the starting lineup. Definitely by no means was an upgrade, but it shouldn't have made the defense worse than it was the prior season, which was about average in the NBA. But it turns out that having that talent is not always enough. The Kings went from a 48-win team that made the playoffs to a 46-win team that made the play-in, won one play-in game, but then eventually missed the playoffs, to now a 40-win team that didn't even win a single play-in game, even at home, against a pretty sorry Mavericks team. And so it's two straight seasons of missing the playoffs, but missing the playoffs this season feels a whole lot different than missing the playoffs last season, because there's no longer a bright future to look towards. And that's really what makes this season feel like such a disaster. It's not just what happened on court, the end result of the season. It's that the Kings went from a really exciting, relatively young team that felt like it had finally shed all of the terrible narratives that came along with the Kings franchise for the past 2 decades. And they went to a team that reverted to dysfunction, to drama, and most importantly, to mediocrity, with no obvious way out of that mediocrity. So in short, the season was a complete and utter failure, a disaster. But I think the funny part is, and maybe this makes it even more sad, is if I were to go through and rate every single individual player on this team, say from 1 to 10, and especially the actual rotational players, right? The guys that played. I think the average would probably be around a 6, 7 out of 10. But then when I go to grade the team as a whole, then it's like a 2 out of 10 for this season. And I think the difference in those ratings kind of perfectly explains why the Kings failed. They didn't fail because they didn't have enough talent. They didn't fail because individual players necessarily performed poorly, at least not given what their role should have been, but it was just that the talent didn't go together, and that their talent was asked to play in roles that they were uncomfortable with. So I'm going to start talking about this season by breaking it into 3 parts, looking at each of those 3 parts of the regular season, with the first part being the Mike Brown era, the first 31 games of the season where the team went 13-18 before Mike Brown was fired. The second part is, of course, the transition period where Doug Christie comes in as interim head coach, just tries to hold everything together. The team got the classic, new coach buff, the honeymoon period for a little bit, but of course that would not last because of the De'Aaron Fox trade. And then, of course, the final part of the season is the post-trade deadline Zach LaVine era of the team. And I said that the second part of the season was a transition period, but really it kind of felt like all 3 parts of the season was a transition period. All of the season was a transition period. First, trying to integrate DeMar DeRozan, then having a new coach, and then finally getting Zach LaVine and a few other pieces and trying to integrate them. Add in some of the injuries that the Kings had, especially later in the season, and it felt like the team was never truly cohesive. One of the things that Zach LaVine has constantly said since he got to Sacramento is that this isn't 2K, right? You can't just put pieces together and expect it to work immediately. Teams need time and players need time to be able to come together and form a cohesive unit. And so I think it's a shame that we never truly got to see what this team could have been, the roster at the beginning of the season, what it could have been, because that roster was cut so short. And then even what the roster at the end of the season could have been like if they were given a full season. But the fact that the team was never really settled in, I think shows that the Kings organization is reverting back to old ways, that the organization has taken a step backward into its old ways of never having stability, and that's kind of why Fox didn't want to be here anymore. And so for this season review, I'm going to go through each of the 3 different parts, talk about what went well, but then ultimately what led to kind of the failure of this team. And then at the end, I'll have some negative takeaways from this season, but then, of course, I want to end on a positive note. I think it's always good to end on a positive note, so I'll talk about, what positives we can take away from this season, what we can look forward to going into the offseason, going into next season. So starting out with the beginning of the season, like I said, expectations were pretty high, but of course some growing pains were expected early on with integrating DeMar DeRozan, and that was definitely one of the stories early on. I would say there were 4 main problems early in the season. The first being the integration of DeMar DeRozan. The second, that maybe kind of goes hand in hand with that, is playing the wrong lineups, especially late in games. The third being the 3-point shooting, and then the fourth being the depth of the team. So starting with the first 2, integrating DeMar DeRozan, we saw the challenges of some of the lineups that the Kings were playing, especially with how the Kings were really struggling to close out games. The Kings were extremely poor in clutch games early on. They lost 11 games by 5 points or less with Mike Brown as the coach in the first 31 games of the season. And so one of those reasons could just be you're integrating DeMar DeRozan, a guy who wants the ball in the clutch, and then you also have Fox who wants the ball in the clutch, and you have other offensive players, and so you're just figuring it out offensively. And so it makes sense that would take a little bit of time. The Kings' overall net rating was pretty good. They had a plus 1.1. There were a lot of things to like about what the Kings were doing overall, but they just needed some time to learn how to close games. But then the other reason the Kings were losing some of these close games is the closing lineup they were running out there. And that definitely brings me to one of the biggest talking points of this entire season, which is the underutilization of Keon Ellis. Malik Monk was ending games alongside Fox, DeMar, Keegan, Sabonis. And that was pretty surprising to me coming into the season. My stat to watch for Monk was how many clutch minutes he played, because I really didn't see a path for him to be able to close games. But then the season starts and, well, he's just thrown into the closing lineup with all the other guys, and it just didn't really make sense to me because there wasn't a spot for him. But the Kings decided to go full out offense, throw Malik Monk in there, have some very unbalanced lineups. Coming into the season, I think we were all extremely excited about seeing Keon Ellis play a big role for the entire season. He was coming into his 3rd year, but really his 2nd full year, but kind of his 1st full year because he just broke into the NBA the season prior. And I was actually one of the people before the season started that was kind of trying to temper people's expectations about Keon, just because the sample size wasn't huge for him and the team had still been good with Herter starting. So I was thinking it's going to be a battle for this starting position. I think everyone just kind of assumed Keon would get the starting spot, which he did not, right? Kevin Herter got the starting spot back. And obviously after just a little while, that didn't really make sense why he continued to have that starting spot. I think we can all agree on that. Apparently there were some people in the Kings organization that were a part of that decision along with Mike Brown, but let's not really get into that. We've talked about that enough. I really don't want to get into that. But to me, this really isn't even about who was starting between Herter and Keon. And it's just really about who was closing the game and the fact that neither of them were closing the games. Kevin Herter forgot how to shoot the basketball. But with him in the starting lineup, the Kings were still a good team. And they had been a good team with him in the starting lineup the previous 2 seasons. I'm not saying he should have been starting, but I'm just saying that it became clear that Malik Monk shouldn't have been the one closing. In 431 minutes this season, the Kings had a plus .3 net rating with Monk playing with the rest of the starters. With Herter in there in 184 minutes, they had a plus 9.5. And in 80 minutes with Keon Ellis, it was a plus 20.4. And so I think what that shows is just a little bit of balance helps a lineup a lot. Obviously, we see a guy like Keon Ellis come in and add his defense, add his shooting, but also a guy like Kevin Herter coming in just with his physical traits, just with being long and being a solid team defender, even if he isn't a good one-on-one defender at all. Like, that still is very helpful. And when Malik Monk was in the game, the team got absolutely shredded. And actually, the Kings had a better defensive rating with Herter in the starting with the starters than Keon Ellis, and it was the offensive rating that was so much better with Keon. And obviously we didn't get a full season sample size of that. Wish we would have gotten more of a sample size, but I'll definitely come back to how I think Keon affects the offense later on. I think he's underrated offensively. But I think the big takeaway here is you should have been playing at least Kevin Herter, if not Keon Ellis, in the closing lineups. Like, if you really didn't like Keon Ellis's gambly defensive style, at least play Kevin Herter and not Malik Monk, because the Malik Monk lineups just didn't work and you lost a ton of close games because of it. But like I said, Keon was actually making the Kings a better offensive team than Kevin Herter was, and that brings me to the next problem with the Kings early on this season, which was just the three-point shooting. They shot 34.2% through the first 31 games. It was even worse really early on in the season, and they just slowly trended up all season long. Early on this season, Herter forgot how to shoot. Keegan couldn't shoot. Fox couldn't shoot. Monk couldn't shoot. And Lyles couldn't shoot. The only consistent shooters on this team were Keon Ellis and Domantas Sabonis. And that's just unfortunate. You know, it's not necessarily anyone's fault that everyone just started cold. That was really just an unfortunate part of the start of the season, but it's definitely part of the story. But then the last problem with the start of the season was the depth. And this is where the offseason was really disappointing, because you got DeMar, which addressed some needs, but not the biggest needs, which was, size, athleticism, defense. And off the bench, you only had 3 playable guys in Keon Ellis, Malik Monk, and Trey Lyles, when you were starting Kevin Herter, of course. Len was disappointing. You traded Davion and brought in Jordan McLaughlin, who was disappointing. But these are guys on minimums, right? And so how much can you really expect from them? You were expecting too much from these guys. So you were really relying on guys on minimums when you should have made moves for more reliable, better fitting pieces. And, obviously, like the Davion Mitchell trade sucked. You bring in Jalen McDaniels and you have to ship him out. Like, everything around the DeMar DeRozan move sucked in the offseason, really. And drafting Devin Carter and him getting injured was just super unfortunate early on. And then also, for some reason, you have Keon Ellis not even playing a ton of minutes, so that's hurting your depth even more. And, he got a few DNPs. I think that's probably a little overblown when people talk about the DNPs. Really, it was just, why is he not playing like 30 minutes? It was very confusing. And so you're trying to integrate DeMar into poorly balanced lineups with bad three-point shooting and a lack of depth. And those really all came from the same origin, which is you don't have the right pieces to fit together. And the one guy who does fit and could solve most of those problems, or at least like help solve them, is Keon Ellis. He wasn't getting enough minutes. And so morale was down with the team. Drama ensued. Certain people in the organization, including players like Sabonis and I think Monk and Herter, were against Mike Brown. So then he gets fired. And that leads us into the second part of the season, which was really just an odd portion of the season, because Doug Christie comes in, he simplifies things. The Kings have this like honeymoon period, right? The team starts playing better. And it wasn't because of like the lineups or anything. Like, they were starting Malik Monk, which is something that happened at the very end of Mike Brown's time, and they were still starting Monk. They were still ending with him, and they just started to be able to actually close games. They didn't lose any clutch games. And so that was just the difference. Like, the net rating was way worse under Doug Christie, but they just pulled out the close games. But it was such a weird time because we knew that Fox wasn't going to stick around, and the organization knew if they fired Mike Brown, De'Aaron Fox wasn't going to stick around, and eventually that got leaked out as well. And so it was a dead team. They were getting some wins, so we were kind of happy, but at the same time, it kind of was all for nothing because we knew it was a dead team. Fox was going to be traded, and then Fox gets traded. Everyone's distraught. There's drama, there's bad vibes. And so there really isn't anything basketball-wise to take away from that middle portion of the season because none of it really mattered after the deadline. And so the Kings brought in Zach LaVine. They brought in Jonas Valanciunas. They brought in Jake LaRavia. So obviously the Kings were trying to continue to win now, replace Fox with LaVine. The Valanciunas trade was a pretty good one because Sabonis got injured. Valanciunas provided that backup big that we needed, and he could step into a starting role with Sabonis going down. Not an athletic defensive player that we needed, but a guy off the bench that we needed because the Kings' depth was lacking. Same with LaRavia, finally providing some wing depth, some wing defense. LaRavia was great, and hopefully we can keep him going into next season. LaVine comes in, and he has big shoes to fill, and we're asking him to step in, be a first option, replace De'Aaron Fox, who's a point guard. So it's kind of a tough situation for LaVine, but the Kings addressed some of the issues. They addressed the lack of depth, the three-point shooting with Zach LaVine. And the Kings had one nice stretch of basketball beating some subpar teams. LaVine played really well. Valanciunas stepping in for Sabonis really well. But then for the most part, during that final stretch of the season, the team was super underwhelming. So the trade deadline fixed a few things. Devin Carter also came back, fixed some of the depth issues because he started to contribute. But then the trade deadline also just created a whole new set of problems. We needed to integrate now a new player in Zach LaVine, and obviously Valanciunas and LaRavia and Devin Carter as well, but mainly Zach LaVine. We didn't have point guard play. We're still playing unbalanced lineups, at least at first, starting Malik Monk. There was no true point guard. And so you have to start Malik Monk because he's the closest thing we really have. But now you've sacrificed all the defense. And so the first starting lineup we tried with Monk, LaVine, DeRozan, Keegan, Sabonis had a net rating of minus 8.4, including a defensive rating of 123 in 196 minutes together. That is awful and unsustainable solution. So eventually Keon got moved in the starting lineup. That lineup together had a minus 0.9. So it's not good, but it's a lot better. That lineup forced DeMar to play point guard. And while DeMar was not bad in that role at all, he made plenty of great plays. His assist to turnover ratio was great. It wasn't a great solution, and it's not a long-term solution for sure. And so the Kings really lacked creation, which meant we weren't optimizing Zach LaVine, right? LaVine would go underutilized for a lot of his time on the court. He never really developed a relationship with Sabonis. So hopefully if they're both on the team next year, hopefully they can really get a connection going. And then you have DeMar, who he's a scorer, right? But now he really just has to lean into playmaking. So you're not utilizing him in his best spot of just a scorer. And then Sabonis doesn't have a point guard to set him up. And so the team really just lacked identity. And the best stretches of basketball for the team came with guys like Keon Ellis, Devin Carter, Keegan Murray, Jake LaRavia, making defensive plays and allowing the Kings to get out in transition. The Kings needed to become a defensive-minded team that really thrives in transition. LaVine and Sabonis both great transition players. But the problem was it just wasn't possible to always put out enough defensive guys when your top 4 paid players are not defensive guys. And then also having DeMar as a ball handler didn't help with pushing the pace. I think DeMar did a good job at times of trying to push the pace, but he's just not that type of player. Then some injuries happened. Obviously Sabonis got injured early on, but you have LaRavia and then Monk, which just sucked, hurting the creation even more, hurting the depth in the wing defense even more with LaRavia going down. And so the season came to a really disappointing end. It ended on a very negative note with way more questions than we came into the season with. And most of the negative takeaways from this season are kind of off-court things. The on-court problems for this team really just changed as the season went on. going from, a lack of depth to a lack of point guard play, things like that. Things changed obviously with all of the trades, but one thing remained as a constant, consistent on-court problem. And I think every single person who watched this team a lot knows what that is. It's the three-point defense. The Kings finished dead last in the league in opponent three-point shooting percentage at 38.1%. Or hey, maybe we can look at it as the Kings were first. They were first in opponent field goal three-point percentage. At least they were first in something. But the way this team is built, they dedicate a lot to defend the paint because they don't have a shot blocker. And so that means that everyone has to constantly be perfect with their rotations and be ready to go close out on a player and then recover. They have to be able to stay in front of perimeter players to keep the other team from forcing those rotations. And the Kings just don't have the personnel to do that. DeMar, Monk, Levine, Sabonis, Fox at the start of the season, Lyles, Valanciunas, I could go on. They aren't built to play in a defense like that. Every game, we went into a game, and the game plan was, okay, which one of these players are we leaving open and hoping that they miss from three? And when you do that with NBA players, more often than not, they're going to hit some threes if they're wide open. Every game, it's like, okay, we're going to double this star player and leave this guy wide open, right? That's just, it's not a sustainable plan. But then moving on to kind of the negatives that came out of this season from more of an off-court perspective, the Kings lost stability that I thought they had been building. They fired Mike Brown, fired Monte McNair, traded De'Aaron Fox. And all of this happened in a very drama-filled way. And it looked really bad on the organization, and that's not very fun. When the season ended, Monte McNair gets fired immediately, and Scott Perry gets hired immediately. We already had assistant GMs, assistant coaches leaving in the middle of the season. So any type of stability was completely out the window. And the team also went from a pretty young team, a relatively young team, to an older team and an older mediocre team, which is just the worst place to be. The organization didn't pick a path, or if you want to say they picked a path, yeah, they picked a path of just being mediocre. And I just feel like it's a team that's wasting a bunch of talent. Because like I keep saying, the team has talent. There's a lot of talented guys. There's all-stars on this team. But it feels like they're just kind of being wasted. They're being wasted on a team that has no identity. And Scott Perry came in. And in his introductory press conference, he talked about wanting an identity. Wanting defense, accountability, toughness, etc. Guys that were volunteers to that identity and not hostages. That's a line that I loved. He said all the right things, right? It seems like he understands that the team needs a defensive identity and a fast-paced identity around Sabonis and Levine. And so that's all great, but it doesn't mean much until he acts on these ideas and gets rid of the players that don't fit this identity and brings in players that do fit this identity. So that was a lot of negatives, which, is understandable because it just wasn't a successful season. So of course there are going to be a lot of negative takeaways. But I think it's always good to end with positives, what we can look forward to from this team. And so this is pretty much where I want to be able to appreciate what each player did individually, because like I said a million times, a lot of talent doesn't fit together. That doesn't mean that the players performed poorly. So, I'm thankful for the new guys. Zach LaVine came in, was put into an extremely tough spot. He had to replace such a beloved figure in Sacramento, be a number one option, was supposed to figure it out in like a second. That was the expectation. And in his short time, he had some great moments. When he gets on a heater, he might be the most exciting player in the entire league. He dropped 43 points, 42 points, 37, 36, 32, all in only 32 games with the Kings. That is pretty insane. He shot 44.6% from three with the Kings on 7.2 attempts per game. We may never see another player in a Kings uniform that shoots like that in our entire lives. Like, it's insane. And so I feel like we need to appreciate that. And then other guys that, came in mid-season, Jake LaRavia, Jonas Valanciunas, were super fun to watch. Really hope that we can retain Jake LaRavia. He had some great moments, of just being on a heater, right away in his first minutes, but he was someone who, with his defense, could just spark a run and didn't have to score at all to make the crowd absolutely pop. Provided wing defense that we've just been starving for so long. The defense, the effort, that's always something that we can appreciate. Valanciunas, our Viking, super fun player to cheer for. Like, how can you not love the guy? Just a massive dude, making people look tiny. And it was super fun having two of the strongest guys in the entire league just for 48 minutes put guys under the basket, right? Sabonis for 36 minutes, and then you think you have a break for the other 12 minutes. No, it's even worse. You're facing an even stronger guy in Jonas Valanciunas. So it's fun to see those two Lithuanians play together on the same team. And then, of course, we have to appreciate Sabonis's greatness. Like, continuing to put up absurd numbers. 19 points, almost 14 rebounds, 6 assists per game. Led the league in, of course, rebounding and double-doubles again. Would have loved to see those assist numbers be a little higher. They were 6 assists is the lowest as a King outside of that, half a season when he first got traded here. So we definitely need to get back to, him being on the ball more, get those assist numbers back up if he's still a King next season. But he's always fun to watch because he's always giving 100% effort every single time he's on the court. And then also the 3-point shooting, 40+% from 3 this season. That was a really fun story to watch that develop. And then we got DeMar DeRozan in his one season in Sacramento. We'll see if he, sticks around for another season. But he was super fun to watch. A legend of the game, just dominating the mid-range, watching him rise up the all-time scoring ranks as a King. He led mid-range scoring by just a massive amount in the entire NBA. He came in and produced exactly what was expected. Exactly what I expected and wanted from him. Like, he absolutely did what he needed to do, had those clutch moments. He's just one of those guys that I'm glad I was able to see on the Kings at some point in their career. A little bit like seeing a guy like Vince Carter be on the Kings for a season. And then I want to go through some rapid fire shout-outs. Shout out Doug McDermott for being one of the most fun deep bench players in the league, coming in and just lighting it up from 3. Isaac Jones getting an NBA contract. Terrence Davis coming back and making a return to the NBA. Markelle Fultz earning his way back into the NBA. Same with Scal. Terry Taylor. Shout out to Monk for finally getting a starting spot, even if it didn't work out, finally starting on this team and having one of the best pick and roll relationships in the entire league with Sabonis. Shout out to Jay Crowder for getting signed, immediately starting a game, and then just never playing again. That was an extremely wild thing that happened. That's a trivia question for sure, 10 years from now. Shout out Mason Jones and Isaiah Crawford for bringing home the G League championship to Stockton. Trey Lyles for some great years in Sacramento just as a whole, because he's a free agent at the end of the season. We'll see, if he's re-signed, but he didn't really have the 3-ball going this year, but contributed in so many other ways, stepping into a backup 5 role, giving constant effort, taking charges, getting on the offensive glass. Such a great hustle player. And then finally, we have to talk about what we can take away from this season that makes us excited for the future. Our rookie, Devin Carter, it was obviously not the way he wanted to start out his NBA career, sitting on the sidelines with a shoulder injury. But then he came in and he earned minutes at the end of this season. He earned those minutes. Those were not minutes just given to him because he's our rookie and our 13th overall pick. He earned those minutes through doing exactly what the team needed someone to do, which was ball pressure, right? The defense, the hustle, the rebounding. The shot is still a question. The offense as a whole is still a question, but I think you can absolutely see the potential there. I'm really excited for a full summer league from him, and then hopefully, just a healthy season next season. And then you can add in Jake LaRavia as a young guy to be excited about if we sign him. And then you have the 2 guys that I have saved for last, because they were the two guys that I loved watching the most this season. I was saving the best for last. Keegan Murray and Keon Ellis. I just love these guys so much. With Keegan, I think Keegan is super underrated to a lot of fans, both Kings fans and then definitely just generally NBA fans. I don't think people really understand how good of a defender Keegan is. I see these like posts on Instagram where they go through each team and show who the most disappointing player on each team was. And it's always Keegan for the Kings. And I'm just, and to be fair, like most of them are wrong. You know, like for most teams, it's like, why is it this guy? Why is it this guy? Like they're all so stupid. But I think it just shows how people just like look at the box score, right? And just like, oh, Keegan is, points are down. His 3-point shooting is eh. And I always see fans being super surprised when he comes up like super highly ranked in defensive metrics. Like people don't understand how good of a defender Keegan is. There's a stat from B-Ball Index. Only 5 players finished 85th percentile or higher in rim protection and perimeter isolation defense. Alex Caruso, Amen Thompson, Asar Thompson, Jalen Williams, and Keegan Murray. He guarded 1 through 5, literally 1 through 5 this season. He's upped his rebounding every single year in the NBA, and he just doesn't get credit for what he does because when he makes a big play, he doesn't make a big deal out of it. He took a leap in guarding bigger players, bigger, stronger players this season, and in my opinion, is the best defender on the Kings. His versatility, strength, speed, length. I don't know where the Kings would be without him. We started to see some chase down blocks from him. Was a much better rim protector this year than last year. His rotations were always on time. I think he's underrated because he doesn't gamble. He plays disciplined defense and just makes it look easy. He also took strides offensively that maybe aren't the easiest to see because he had a lesser role offensively this season. It would be nice if he could, start a season well from 3 just for once in his life. But he was strong on his drives, especially in transition, started to learn how to use his body to finish around the rim. And so I hope the Kings just really lean into him offensively in the future to really see what he can be. And then we have Keon Ellis. This guy just kept his head down, kept working, grinding until he finally got the starting spot that he deserved the entire time. And now I have something to say that may come out as slightly negative towards Keon at first, but I just need you guys to stick with me because there's a reason I'm saying it. And before I say it, I want to make it clear that Keon is an amazing defender. He's great. Okay, but I needed to preface it with this because I don't want to get crucified by Kings fans for maybe slightly criticizing Keon. He's an amazing player. I think Kings fans may overrate him a tad bit defensively. Again, he's still a great defender. I don't think he's like an all NBA defender, at least not this season. That doesn't mean he couldn't develop into that because he's still young and developing, very young player. But he plays, a gambling style of defense. And that was one of the reasons that I think Mike Brown didn't really trust him all that much. Again, I'm not saying Mike Brown was right to not play him because of that. I'm just saying, that's the truth. I just think Keon's kind of a feast or famine type of player defensively. And I don't think he's the best player to consistently be putting on the other team's best guard. It doesn't mean he can't do it. He definitely can, but there were times where he got exploited by a Jalen Brunson, a Donovan Mitchell, others. And so while I think he may be a tad bit overrated defensively, I think he's super underrated offensively. He's a great two-way player. And to me, I would much rather have a player that is a great defender, but maybe not the best defender in the league, but who can actually contribute a lot offensively. And that's exactly what Keon does. We saw his 3-point shooting has been sustained. I didn't think there was any way he could do it, but he did. 43.3% from 3 is insane. He showed a floater, a mid-ranger, could shoot off the dribble, hit step backs, showed some passing skills. So I think he really hasn't reached his peak potential offensively. And, I don't think he's reached his potential defensively either. But having a two-way player like that is so much more valuable than just a guy that can defend. And so the reason I bring this all up is because I think Keon and Keegan can make such a great pairing defensively. Because I don't think Keon is the best guy to just go out and guard one-on-one the best guards in the league because of his very gambly style. He's a defensive playmaker. Keegan is just the solid, reliable defender. And so when Keegan can take the best on-ball perimeter player and Keon can just play off the ball and be a roamer and just wreak havoc, that's where the Kings are at their best defensively, I think. Because Keon's best trait is his anticipation, is his jumping of the passing lanes, getting deflections, right? His best trait isn't staying in front of guys on ball. It's how he can disrupt things with his anticipation, with his hands off ball. The problem with the way that the Kings roster is constructed is that there are many times where it isn't the case, where Keegan can take the best perimeter player. Keegan had to guard up, right? He had to guard 1 through 5, and he said he would rather not guard 5s next season. But when he did have to guard the bigger players, that forced Keon to be the best perimeter defender. And again, Keon can do that well, but I don't think he does it as well as Keegan. And I don't think that's maximizing the defensive potential for him or Keegan. Keegan can guard bigger guys, but I don't think that's where he's at his best. And so I think the Kings really need to bring in a 4-man that can play alongside these guys, that can defend, take the burden of guarding the bigger players, the Paolos, the Jokic's, the LeBrons off of Keegan, which in turn allows Keegan to be able to guard the best perimeter players, which in turn takes Keon off of those players, off ball, where he can roam, be a ball hawk. And I just think that maximizes everyone's potential defensively. But Keon had a great year defensively and offensively. No doubt one of my favorite players to watch. I mean the way that he can just spark a run with his defense. Such a defensive playmaker. I just hope the Kings really lean into him, lean into Keegan, lean into young guys, young defensive two-way guys next season. But that's it for the 24-25 season. It was a bit of a roller coaster season, a bit of a wild season. It didn't end how we wanted to. But like I went through, there were so many things that we could appreciate about this season, and I'll always have fun watching this team no matter what. So next up is the offseason. I'll be making an off-season preview relatively soon. It'll be super interesting to see what Scott Perry does. Does he come in? Does he back up what he said, right? Does he lean into a defensive identity? Does he get rid of the players that don't fit the identity? Is he going to be allowed to have free reign by Vivek Ranadive? Because the Kings are kind of at a crossroads right now, right? We should have a new head coach very soon. Maybe that's Doug Christie. Maybe it's not. You might know who that coach is right now, but I do not, because he said it should be announced pretty soon. So I'm really excited for this offseason. But for now, that is it for this episode of the Roll Report. Make sure to subscribe, turn on those notifications so you know whenever I post this offseason. Thank you guys for a great season, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.